about design thinking. It's not a common concept in healthcare, actually. If you've heard it before, you can drop in the chat. Design thinking basically is a common concept or tool that was developed for designers, right? For some of us some of people that design website, or you must have heard about the UX, or the user experience interface, right? The designer that do this, they tend to use the design thinking, right? And there are different tools by which you can create innovation. But in healthcare, design thinking has been found to be quite important and quite helpful, and I will tell you why. Now, this is a diagram that shows you how design thinking actually interfaces with user-centered design and patient-centeredness. In healthcare, one thing that we try to promote is that we try to, as much as possible, empower the patient to be able to make decisions for themselves, right? So in whatever management of a patient or the client, depending on who's seeing it, the person, you must involve them in making that decision. And that is what we call patient-centeredness, right? So because patient-centeredness is quite important in healthcare, design thinking has also found its way into healthcare, basically. And what that does is that it puts the patient at the center of your innovation. In the course of this webinar, we'll be spending a lot of time on design thinking. And the goal of this webinar is that by the time you leave here, you'll be able to think of your innovative ideas through the lens of design thinking. So those are the different phases of design thinking, basically. Although I pull them linearly, but in real life, when you are doing design thinking, they don't follow this particular linear way. Depending on what you are looking for, any of them can come first, and I'll give you an example, right? So we have these 5 phases basically in design thinking. The first phase is empathy, basically to empathize, right? And this is where, of course, you interface with the user. So depending on who you are creating your solution for, you have to interface with them. You have to understand what they need. You have to understand also their emotions and their behavior. This phase is also called the discovery phase. This is when you want to discover what the problem is. Let's get it right here. When you work in healthcare, or when you interface or you observe any challenge in healthcare, the first thing you do is that you create, probably you say, oh, this is a problem that needed to be solved. But at that point, when we are watching, it does not give you all the whole concept of the problem or the root causes of the problem, which we're going to see later. You still need to interface with the stakeholders. And one of the stakeholders, of course, will involve your users. So your users can be the patient, if you are designing something for the patient. If you're, for example, if you are designing a digital tool for a patient to use for education, you can interface with them to understand their level of education, to understand if it will be useful for them. If you are designing something that the nurses will use, then you have to interface with the nurses, right? If you are designing something that the administrative department will use, you have to interface with them to understand the problem more. And that is where this first phase is. It's about discovery. The empathy there is also about what I talk about, user-centeredness. So it's not just about technicalities, also understanding the emotions that is linked to this problem. Then after you've discovered what the real problem is, then the next phase is that you have to define. Now, defining it means you have to develop your problem statement. And we still see what problem statement is. Then the next part is ideation. Ideation simply means generating creative ideas, and also changing your problems from just being a problem to idea that you want innovate around. Then the other part is prototyping, and also we have testing. For this particular webinar, we're going to be looking at phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. Hopefully, subsequently, we should be able to look at prototyping, how to develop your minimal viable product, and also how to test your idea. But for today, we are going to look at 1, 2, 3, and ideate. Now that we've talked about design thinking, let's see how a practical use of design thinking in healthcare. And this is an interesting one. What I'm going to do now is to bring up something that we probably were already used to. First, I said don't design what your end user won't use. That's quite important. And that is the need for you to, and that also buttresses the fact that you need to interface with your end user right from the get-go. Now, there is this particular story that captured this idea of interfacing with end user. There is this guy. He was a designer with GE Healthcare. GE Healthcare is one of the big company that are innovating around healthcare, developing machines like X-ray, like MRI, like CT scan, and all those stuff. So they have this designer, that was actually moved by the fact that there's a need to develop an MRI for children. How many of us have seen an MRI before? If you've seen an MRI, this is what an MRI look like, right? So you just something like this. So the guy's name is Dong. So Dong actually, as a designer for GE Healthcare, spent about over 2 years building this cutting-edge MRI scanner for children. And when he did this particular MRI was technically sound, and a lot of hospitals were really happy to really take this particular innovation. So when he designed this, of course, he made them available to different hospitals. But something happened. One day, Doc actually went to visit some of these hospitals and realized that children were not using this particular MRI, or they were really scared going into the MRI. I've worked in hospitals, of course, with MRI, but I know even as an adult, getting into something like this can be scary, So he noticed that a lot of children were crying, and there was a lot of fear, And this brought up this discussion about what was wrong with this particular design, And that is where design thinking is. Could it have been that Doc actually designed this particular innovation without discussing with experts around this place to really see what will a child want as an MRI? But however, when he noticed this particular issue, he had to use the design thinking to be able to solve it. So the first thing he did, as we said, was to empathize, right? To discover what the problem is. And discovering what the problem is that he needs to see this particular innovation through the eyes of a child, the patient, not just the technicality of it. So whenever we are designing something, of course, you might be an IT person, working in healthcare with a lot of idea about code, which is interesting. But the most important thing is that you should know that the patient do not see your code. That what they see is the end product that they interface with. And this was the issue with this particular design. So in empathizing, he ensured that he talked to different stakeholders, and stakeholders here, of course, include parents and observed children that he saw. He also consulted some specialists to be able to solve this particular problem. Then he moves to the next phase. The next phase is now to trying to reframe the problem, So probably he got it wrong in the first place. You need to reframe it, Instead of focusing on machine specs, he defined the real human challenge. And we're going to see some tools that will help us in reframing a problem in healthcare. One of them is actually what he put here. How might we make MRI scans less scary for children? It's a question, but it's an innovative question. Then after defining the problem, he tried to ideate. Ideation now means that, of course, in there to now sit with different specialists to brainstorm on how to answer this particular question. How do we make this an MRIs less scary for children? And that's where ideation comes in. brought in a pediatrician, brought in designers, brought in also child specialists to be able to look at this. And at the end of the day, they came up with this idea to design a child-friendly MRI. And you can see that MRI is quite child-friendly, right? If you have an MRI like this, I think you have more children, trying to use it. Then, of course, after prototyping this, he tested it with children and realized that what the fear actually dropped. And also, one thing I didn't mention was that when they were using the previous MRI, they were sedating a lot of children to be able to scan them. So that means that there is reduction is also in using sedative to make children sleep so that they can use the MRI. So this is actually how design thinking works. And at the end of the day, he developed this particular MRI. You can see how colorful and beautiful it is, and I'm very sure any child will want to get into this. So this is what design thinking will help you to do with your idea. So it's one thing to have an idea, it's another to be able to frame your idea in a way that will provide a solution that the end user will be able to interface with.